大家好，我是温铁军。我们下面介绍迈克尔·哈德森教授的第3节中世纪和近代欧洲关于地租的政治及理论斗争史。他在这一节里边以这个大宪章这个历史事件为例，进一步讨论了英国封建社会地方土地贵族和当时并不强大的王权。我在上一节说了，他那个时候呢确实还是一个分散的小国那么一种状态，各种各样的小国呢构不成强大的王权，于是乎呢这个土贵族和王权之间的斗争就是长期化的。那他们斗争的一个重要内容呢是土地的地租归属。他说呢，这其实并不涉及什么自由民主，就算是自由，那也是贵族精英们的自由，跟大众、跟老百姓、跟农民没什么关系。因为欧洲在分裂状态，所以各个小邦的这些国王们都要打仗来争取扩大地盘。这还在我们所谓战国那个时期，这点欧洲人也早就说了，说他们还在停留在中国2700多年之前的那种战国纷争的那个阶段上。那因此呢，国王必须收到足够的税赋，收到各种贵族要向王权交纳足够的贡赋，他才能够去打仗。而贵族呢，他们占有的地租，占有的这个收益呢，主要是奢侈消费，并不可能用于工业发展。比如说这场斗争不关老百姓的事儿，也不是什么教科书上所说的那些比较意识形态化的那些鸡汤。那我们再看呢，就是当年早在这个15世纪以后，16世纪以后，就已经在这个靠这个海盗的劫掠形成了海上霸权的这些海洋国家，比如西班牙和葡萄牙。大家都知道他们是离洋流最近的这个国家，就他们可以在海上劫掠。比如说他们当时商船就是战船，商人就是海盗，他们形成的海上霸权，然后进一步利用他们的海上霸权去美洲掠夺。当然这个东西就是相当于他掠夺的越多，他就得到了大量的财富。但这些财富难道会用于这2个国家？大家知道西班牙和葡萄牙到现在为止都不是什么工业化国家，他们掠夺的财富难道是用于他们进入工业化的资本原始积累吗？并不是。而是干嘛呢？用于消费了。尤其是这2个国家呢都是教会势力占主导地位的。也就是说你们到这些国家如果去旅游的话，建议你们好好去看看那些教堂，那教堂里边都是豪华的装饰。你到教堂的那个财库、那个宝库去看看他们的珍宝，那简直就是让你感到非常震撼。大量的劫掠来的金银财宝都在教堂那个财宝库里边放着，它并不进入经济过程，也就是不进入生产，它也不产生用于推进工业化的动力。那老百姓该穷，教会该富就富，对吧？它一直就是这样一种状态。那就是说这些和后来的那个就是比如英国进入工业化完全不一样。所以这个西方到底怎么进入工业化，怎么完成资本原始积累的，怎么形成产业扩张的，这个还是希望大家有点更多的涉猎材料的这种兴趣，咱们多看看，咱们才能有讨论。那从这个角度来说呢，大家知道欧洲的这些就是所谓早期的掠夺国家所获得的财富，因为它不用于工业化，而使得这些国家的技术人才甚至劳工都跑出去了比如西班牙跑到法国，因为它交界那这时候呢，法国正好是工业化起步，它需要发展这时候呢，就等于这些呢，就这个劳动力就转走了。所以呢，这个就是出现了这些欧洲国家的这种差异化，越是掠夺财富多的越不进入工业化，越是掠夺财富少的，那它反而倒是加快进入工业化。所以呢，从它对西方发展的这种差异化的描述来看呢，我们大家应该知道，就是我们现在所看到的那个教科书的那些分析呢，恐怕未必能够真的表达西方是怎么崛起的。
The creditors and the private sector have priority over the government, And the creditors have always wanted a small government, because if you have a large government and you have a democracy, the population at large is going to vote for increasing its living standards, not increasing the 1% at the top. This is the fight that's been going on for 2,000 years. Well, this Roman-based, creditor-based law is the main legacy from European feudalism. Europe inherited this Roman law that was taken over by a hereditary landlord class, the warlords who conquered England and France, the Vikings who conquered Northern Europe. So when the Normans invaded England in 1066, William the Conqueror ordered the Domesday Book to be compiled, a book listing, here's the rent that every piece of land, I'm appointing my companions, I'm appointing them landlords and barons. You're in charge of the land, you're in charge of collecting this rent for yourself, and much of it will have to be paid to the crown, to myself, in order for me to go to war and conquer yet more land, so we can get yet more rent and create a big empire. Kings tend to overreach themselves and wage too much war. And a century after William the Conqueror conquered England, King John in the 13th century was so oppressive, insisted that all the land tax be turned over to him, that the barons revolted. They wrote the Magna Carta, which is considered presented in the history books as the Great Charter of Freedom. Well, it was freedom for the landlords to take all of the rent for themselves and not to have to give all the rent to the kings. It wasn't freedom for the people. The ruling class, the landlord class, defines freedom as freedom for itself. And democracy is the right for its members to vote in the House of Lords, but to keep the rest of the population without very much power in the House of Commons. Well, a similar privatization of rents by absentee owners occurred throughout all of Europe, and there was a constant struggle. The landlords used most of their rents on buying houses and on luxury, and the kings used most of their rental income and taxes for war making. And this did not leave very much money available to alleviate poverty or actually to grow. So all of the silver and the gold that Spain and Portugal looted from Latin America, from the New World, this silver and gold went right through it to the rest of Northern Europe, because the king took everything, the landlords took everything, and there was no spending on industry at all. Spain was the America of its day. It could wage war, but it couldn't produce any industrial goods. So any income that it was able to extract from the colonies that it founded, it just spent and left the population as a whole poor and poor. And so the skilled labor migrated from Spain, migrated from Portugal to play, and from autocratic countries like southern Italy. They went to England, France, and became the workmen for Europe, just as American capital is flowing out. Gradually, you had the progress of science by the 18th century began to lead to a flourishing of industry. In Britain, France, throughout Europe, there was a flourishing of industry. Not in America, because England would and France would not permit industry in the colonies. They wanted to dominate it. But you had French taxes and rents so high that domestic industry couldn't compete with that of Britain, because the people had to pay so much money for the land, for the housing that they had. So a group of reformers clustered around the royal surgeon, Francois Quesnay, who created the first major statistical accounting format, the Tableau Économique, in 1758. And that accounting format showed how the circulation of income within France and how almost all of the economic surplus over and above subsistence ended up being paid to the landlords. They called themselves the economists, les économistes. The first meaning of the economists were people who could explain how the economic surplus was all paid for land rent, and how that should be the form of taxation, so that the government would not tax handicraft workshops, it wouldn't tax labor, it wouldn't tax industry, and that way you'd make industry more competitive, and France could outcompete with England with its landlord-ridden economy. In order to industrialize and become more affluent, France had to break away from this overhead, and they began to publish widely. And one of the visitors to France was Adam Smith, and he met with him. And when he returned to Scotland, he wrote The Wealth of Nations and adopted the French reform principles. And he explained that taxes should fall on the land, not on industry, because the landlords, here's what he wrote, and I'll quote, "Landlords love to reap where they have not sown, and demand a rent even for the land's natural produce." He also wrote, "The dearness, that is the expensiveness, of house rent in London arises above all from the dearness of ground rent. Every landlord acting the part of the monopolist." So the landlords in England had monopolized the land, charged a lot of rent, and that was pricing England out of the market. Taxing the land was very difficult to exceed because the landlords controlled the upper house, the House of Lords throughout Europe. But it began to be challenged after the French Revolution. That led to Napoleon trying to conquer all Europe, and as he marched against Prussia and Germany and other countries, he spread liberal reforms. And he went to war with England in 1798, and that war lasted until 1815. And France imposed a naval blockade of England so that England couldn't import its food or import other things. It interrupted the sea trade. So unable to import much food, Britain had to fall back on its own domestic farming sector, which was owned by the landlords. And crop prices rose to reflect the limited supply because you couldn't import the food anymore. And peace was finally restored by the Treaty of Ghent in 1815 after Napoleon was defeated. And at that point, British industry said, "This is wonderful. Now we can get low-priced food again, like grain from America, grain from Latin America, and we can have low food prices again." But British landlords, who were in control of the House of Lords, persuaded Parliament to impose tariffs on grain imports. And these were called the Corn Laws, to artificially maintain the high domestic crop prices by keeping the and they said, if we can prevent import of food, then we can keep charging high rents for the land because the farmers who lease the land from us can afford to sell the crops at a higher price and pay us more high rents. So a fight ensued over the Corn Laws that finally were repealed in 1846. And this became the occasion for a landmark debate between Malthus, who's most famous for his population theory, arguing on behalf of the landlords, and David Ricardo, who was the parliamentary spokesman for England's banking class. Industry was not yet a bank client, but what the banking class wanted wasn't industry itself so much, it wanted international trade, because most banking income came from financing international trade. This goes back to the 13th century when Christianity had banned charging interest, but it didn't ban charging foreign exchange fees or moving money from one country to another. So banks couldn't charge interest for a few hundred years, but they could charge foreign exchange fees. So way into the 19th century, banks still said, we want foreign trade, and the way we can make money is having Britain become the workshop of the world, exporting its manufactures in exchange for foreign raw materials and handicrafts. So at the very center of this debate was the concept that really is the topic of today's lecture, the concept of economic rent, which Ricardo developed as part of his free trade argument. He wanted to promote industry, to promote this trade, and to do so, if England was to be an industrial exporter, it had to lower what the employers had to pay. Lowering wages for Ricardo meant lower price of food to be paid to the landlords. He assumed that no matter what the price of food was, workers were going to be paid only a subsistence wage. It was not very good to be a worker in England in the 19th century. And the novels of Charles Dickens were all about the suffering of the working class, the suffering of the middle class. Everybody was pretty much ground down. The fact that the landlord class had a stranglehold on the economy. If you could lower the price of food by importing, then English industrialists could pay workers even more. Workers would not get the benefit of the lowering the price of food because their wages would go down to follow the price at which their food cost. And at that time, food was the major element of the workers' budget. Housing did not play a big role at that time. Food was the big cost to workers. So the logic of industrial capitalism was you have to get rid of Britain's and France's post-feudal aristocracy. It was a rentier aristocracy, an aristocracy living on land rents, interest paid on public debt, on government bonds, which were called rents. So if you could minimize the cost of feeding wage labor, if you could get rid of the landlord class wanting high rents, then you'd be able to outcompete and make England the workshop of the world. And that is precisely what Britain's landlord class opposed. And so Ricardo wrote as the lobbyist for the banks. In 1817, he wrote, "The interest of landlords is always opposed to the interest of every other class in the community." Actually, he wrote that in 1815, right after the Treaty of Ghent. Well, by community, he meant mainly the banking class, his class, and the industrialists that he hoped would produce the exports. He didn't mean the wage-owning class. They weren't even counted as part of the community. So Ricardo spent the next 2 years writing Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. And chapter 2 of that defined economic rent in terms of classical value and price theory. And the whole essence of classical economics down through Marx is price and value theory. The labor theory of value was used by Ricardo to say labor, all ultimate cost of production is the cost of labor. Rent is not a cost of production. Rent is a monopoly price. Rent adds to price in excess of value, and you want to bring prices down in keeping with actual value of labor. So the labor theory of value to Ricardo wasn't to benefit labor. It wasn't to help the working class. It was to help the industrial class be able to borrow more from the banking class to finance its shipping of manufacturers to the New World and to import food. Obviously, many products called for higher prices. Ricardo explained his opponent, what he opposed was the Corn Laws as protective tariffs. And he said, if you have protective tariffs, and let's imagine England has to produce its own land, then as you have the population grow, you're going to have recourse to more and more distant land, to worse and worse lands. And you're going to have fortunate landlords on the very good lands in the center, and they're going to be worse and worse lands, grazing lands that are grown for crops. And the marginal cost of producing crops is going to go up. But this is going to create a huge benefit to the landlords of the fertile land, the first lands to be cultivated. And so this is what was called differential rent. He didn't believe in monopoly rent like Adam Smith had done. He believed differential rent was the fact that some landlords could produce crops on land much more cheaply than landlords on lands that were not so fertile. And he said, even if you have fertilizer, even if you have capital improvements, you're still going to have this natural contrast in soil fertility, differential soil fertility, because of what he called the original and indestructible powers of the soil. Well, of course, scientifically, this was all nonsense. Of course you have fertilizer. Of course you can change the soil. He had to make up a story to explain the difference between price and rent. So even though his agricultural logic was pretty silly when compared to today, the idea of a distinction between price and intrinsic value was very important. Ignoring the role of fertilizer, he thought that these fertility differentials were going to persist. Well, already other writers, David Buchanan, for instance, had edited The Wealth of Nations a few decades after Adam Smith wrote it, and added an extra volume explaining how land rent was a monopoly rent, and they call that absolute monopoly rent, over and above the differential. But what everybody agreed upon was that land rent itself, such as existed, was price without value. Well, Heinrich von Thünen, the German economists, emphasized what really is important is not fertility differentials, because Justus von Liebig and agricultural chemists have shown you can put fertilizer on the land and make it quite fertile. He said it's really transportation. And he created a formula that rent was proportional to the distance from the market multiplied by how much it costs to transport. So when you take transport costs into consideration and the distance to the market, then you have the farms that are closer to the market had a differential rent advantage over farms that are further away. And there followed a whole discussion in the 19th century over who really had to pay the cost of the transportation. And that became a whole other theory. Well, even Adam Smith had recognized the rent of location. Smith had said the corn which grows within a mile of the town sells for the same price with which comes from 20 miles distant. But the latter must bear the cost of shipping the crop to the urban market. So the rent of location wasn't earned, it was there by geography. This geographical rent of location would increase as the economy's overall demand would push up production further and further away. So again, you had the idea that rent was just there by nature, and do you want some landlord just to be able to benefit from having land here, or do you want this benefit to become the natural tax base? Ricardo did not say that rent should be the natural tax base. He only cared about international trade and getting rid of the protectionist corn laws to import grain. But John Stuart Mill, and by the mid 19th century, a new group of reformers saying, wait a minute, you should tax away all of the land rent, as Adam Smith said, because John Stuart Mill said landlords make rent in the sleep. If you want to say what is economic rent, it's what landlords make in their sleep without having to work at all. There's no labor, there's no enterprise. Landlords don't really produce a service except sending out the bill and the collecting agent saying, give us what we're charging you for the rent.
那接下来我们看的这个，当那个拿破仑战争之后，就是当年拿破仑战争这个事儿又是一个值得认真分析的事情啊。我在网上你们能找得到我关于法国大革命的分析，其实就是这个法国当时这个怎么说呢，就是路易16呢，他是一个所谓开明君主。那这时候英国已经完成工业革命了，那英国的商品呢就大量向法国输出，法国正在工业起步的阶段。那如果完全对外开放，对吧？你在你的工业幼稚期啊，你对外开放的，当然外来的商品很便宜啊，就把你自己这个本国少慢差费的工业就打败了，对吧？那恰恰就是这样，这个路易16呢，满足国内的这些要求消费的法国中上阶级，特别是贵族阶级，满足他们的需要，开放了法国市场。英国工业品大量流入法国，击垮了法国幼稚期的工业。那大量的工人失业，变成贫困阶级，贫困阶级上街，而资产阶级呢，这个时候并不为王权提供任何剩余，资产阶级借这个机会，就借王权削弱的机会呢，要求夺权。所以呢，这个法国这个国王呢，本来是召开多种力量参加的这么一个议会吧，想形成一个民主政治， 结果呢，资产阶级拉出去单独开议会去了，他这边呢，他这个权力就大权旁落了。还没等资产阶级商量出个什么结果来呢，怎么跟王权分权？那平民已经穷困潦倒，受不了了，打开界垒战了。这些混乱就不能带来法国社会的实际进步，当然就出现了你方唱罢我登场，不断的有各种激进的革命党上台，然后就杀来杀去。最终呢，这个秩序呢是被这个拿破仑当时是个炮兵旅长，被他用新式武器大炮把这些社会问题解决了。于是乎他就变成了这个独裁者，就最后呢就称帝了。这就是拿破仑这个崛起的这么一个简单的背景分析。当然我这些说法是有点这个诙谐哈，就不是太严肃的去讲这个法国的这段历史。就是说尽管资产阶级崛起，但并不像人们在教科书上所看到的那么辉煌，也不像油画画的那么伟大，它是其实是一个很复杂的过程。那这个法国大革命导致这个新的争论呢，就是围绕自由贸易和谷物法进行的长期争论。争论的核心呢还是地租理论，就是到底劳动价值论还是极差地租那地租呢，它不是生产成本，它只是垄断特权的收益，因此呢，地租本来应该征税。那地租对工业资本主义的不利影响，在当时的法国呢受到了批判。这是拿破仑革命以后，当时呢他鼓励发展资本主义。当然在拿破仑军事这个占领了大量的欧洲的这个地盘的情况下，法国的工业崛起呢并不是简单的就是因为取决于是否能够把地租收益用来进入这个产业资本发展，而在于它实际上形成了一个大的版图的这么一个大帝国，对吧？那它能够摧毁掉所有的竞争对手，因为它的当时代表着工业化的先进生产力的最直接的那个工具就是新式大炮。所以在这个一战之前在一战乃至于包括一战在内，战争之神是大炮。所以拿破仑这个大炮打遍欧洲无敌手。于是乎呢，他就形成了，哪怕你们这些意大利你们这些西班牙你们都掠夺了大量财富，但是在拿破仑大炮之下呢，全都不归你们了，归了拿破仑了，或者叫归了法国的这个占领军了。他能够迅速的进入这样一个财富积累，进入了法国的所谓工业化。那也因此呢，就是不是什么，要我说呢，其实无论怎么争论那都不是到底应该哪一个制度更先进的问题，而是哪个大炮更先进的问题。当然这个分析也是片面的我们不能简单的就把这个欧洲的这个走向工业革命，我们说英国是靠着殖民化扩张变成了一个工业革命的先进国家，法国呢是靠着拿破仑大炮变成了一个进入工业化的这么一个形成财富的这么一个过程。所有这些东西呢，当然都不在教科书讨论范围内，除非你们有条件认真的去欧洲游历一番，好好看看各个博物馆，然后大家可能会有点对于教科书认识的改变。但总之呢，我们说其实这个阶段上已经开始初步形成了后来的所谓超现代社会，就是高级现代化已经形成了现代社会的金融租和金融资本的直接结合的这样一个早期的雏形。所以在学习这一节课程的时候呢，大家应该把早期的西方工业化，特别是英国模式工业化、法国模式工业化把它搞清楚，以及西班牙、葡萄牙等等这些南欧国家它为什么不进入工业化，把这个过程呢搞清楚，我们对于资本主义早期的历史呢可能就会更理解了。好，我就说到这儿，谢谢。